Well, hello, Internet. I usually go by the incredibly pretentious name LC Lupus when I write anything, and so that's what I'm going to call myself while I do this little video. That's probably even more pretentious than the title I gave it. But let's see, shall we? So, what is Far Cry 2? And an even better question, what is this post-colonial rewriting thing? And why did you put a brackets around that prefix neo? We'll get to that one later, but before we talk about any of that stuff, we need to chat about, and maybe go on a few tangents about, Far Cry 2 itself first. So let's chat about Far Cry 2.
Part 1. Let's first just waffle for a bit. Far Cry 2 is a first-person shooter made by Ubisoft and first released on 21 October 2008. The game is set in a fictional Central African country in which a civil war is currently raging. The conflict is between two nearly identical factions that are each trying to destroy the other and take control of the country as a whole. So they're at war, it's pretty simple, really. These factions are both corrupt, deal in blood diamonds, go after refugees, you know, the usual way these kinds of wars are depicted in media. The gameplay itself is marked by slow deliberateness. Nothing is particularly quick or easy. Your character moves slowly, dies rather easily, especially when you get blindsided by a car and are instantly murdered. But anyway, there's a terrible fast travel system, your character can't run for very long, and you have malaria, and you have to take pills every now and then to stop the hazy yellow filter from clouding the edges of your screen. You know, like how malaria works in real life. For those of you who know the original game, you'd realize that this is incredibly different from the first game in the franchise. The first game was set on a tropical island, and there were monsters. So the devs changed some things for the sequel, and in addition to this, in the run-up to the release of the game, Clint Hocking, the creative director, said in an interview that the sequel was only called Far Cry because it was a recognizable brand. They wanted to do their own thing, but having a nice, neat brand already there for the taking was a better marketing gamble, even if the sequel had nothing at all to do with the original. This game was kind of ambitious, but according to the game's producer, Louis-Pierre Ferrand, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, it was supposed to be even more ambitious. But let's not focus on what could have been, let's instead focus on what is. Let's see what this game does, how it does it, why it does it, and then we can get to that important chat about that whole post-colonial thing. And yes, I am going to dangle that like a carrot because big words are intriguing, damn it. Part 2. The pre-Charisma Times.
Now, most of the time, when people think about the Far Cry games, a few people remember the good old days when intellectual property was owned by Crytek back in 2004, but most people remember everything from 2012's Far Cry 3 and beyond. Everyone remembers the bad guys from those games. Everyone remembers Vaas from Far Cry 3, Pagan Min from Far Cry 4, and Joseph Seed from Far Cry 5. But most people seem to just forget that Far Cry 2 even existed.
This could be because the first two games are very different to the rest. The first game is mostly remembered as something that set the benchmark for good PCs back in the day, and the company behind that game would go on to make Crysis, which was lauded for similar technical reasons. People often remember these games because of the graphics. They were really, really pretty, or at least back in the day. Far Cry 2 was a more fledgling thing. It now belonged to Ubisoft, and this was before Assassin's Creed 2 came out, so it's nothing like modern Ubisoft, and the game was wildly different to pretty much everything else that was out there. The closest thing to it, in terms of its dedication to being a more brutal, quote-unquote, realistic thing, was the distinctly Eastern European Stalker series. But Far Cry 2 was never hardcore enough to be quite in the same camp as that thing. Far Cry 2 is from the pre-Charisma times. You see, Far Cry 2 and subsequent games sold themselves based on their antagonists. The central figure of Far Cry 3 was the insane pirate Vaas, and devs knew he was important because he was featured in almost all of their promotional material, flaunting his brand of crazy sadism, and he was on the front cover with a head buried in the sand next to him. That's why it's rather disappointing that, spoiler, he dies halfway through and is instead replaced by a much less interesting character named Volker. However, Volker's characterization was handled the same way. He was made into a central component of the game's narrative, he was everywhere, and he would monologue at you. However, this wasn't actually unique to Far Cry 3. You see, it was in Far Cry 2. In Far Cry 2, you're tasked with hunting down a man known only as the Jackal, and the game pretty much opens with him monologuing at you. It's the same as the other later games, but it wasn't the focus. The focus was mostly on the world. Oh, and the fire physics, because back then, having a special in-game system for rendering realistic fire was an actual selling point that you could put on the back of the box. But let's just forget about that for a second. The game was, as I've said, made during the pre-charisma times. This charisma came along with refinement. The later games are rather notable for being extremely refined experiences. It's difficult to find any actual faults in the gameplay of those later games. The games are fun to play, they're responsive, the environments are good, the whole thing is just a satisfying experience. Well, Far Cry 2 isn't that. Far Cry 2 was made during the experimental days. The devs hadn't figured out how to do stealth properly, they focused on a bit too much realism sometimes, such as running out of breath very quickly when you run as opposed to Far Cry 3's infinite sprinting, and this just makes the empty wastelands that dominate the game's environments a chore to run through. That they also didn't have the slick guns, and there was still weapon degradation. I mean, sometimes your guns could actually explode, and then you wouldn't have that weapon anymore. After Far Cry 2 shipped, they realized that you could dial back on the realism, and people would like it even more. That's why the later Far Cry games aren't as realistic. Sometimes you don't want realism, especially when it makes things boring. Well, unless it's about a decade later and Red Dead Redemption 2 is out and people apparently like monotony again. Anyway, this is actually notable because things have started to swing the other way. Far Cry 2 is, in many ways, an exercise in boredom and realism, but it came at the wrong time. It came a year after Modern Warfare 1. People wanted high-octave action, not slow-paced contemplative experiences. That's boring. Even now, games like that are the exception rather than the rule. But if Far Cry 2 had been released nowadays, it might have received more positive press than it did back in the day. Back then, experimental boredom just wasn't wanted all that much. It wasn't as desirable to the mainstream as it apparently is now. People want those new experiences now. Back then, they were disinterested. But what if we look back at this particular game and look at how it handled that experimental boredom? Part 3. A harsh and boring world.
How do you construct boredom? Well, there are many ways you could do that. If we look at some of those recent examples, such as Death Stranding and Red Dead Redemption 2, you'll often find those games putting emphasis on travel and methodical slowness. Things take time to do, like they do in the real world. Fast travel and similar convenience improvements in games generally help with getting rid of boredom, but these aspects, or rather the absence of them, are what games such as Far Cry 2 and those other ones I mentioned want.
They want to take away your ability to have adequate fast travel because that's instant teleportation. They want you to labor your way through the world, to slog ever on and on. This is why, in Far Cry 2, the fast travel locations are special bus stops that you have to drive to and then go from one bus stop to another and then still be forced to drive the rest of the way. It's dull and annoying, especially seeing as you can't help but drive past enemies that force you into combat you don't want to engage in. However, that's the point. You're supposed to be struggling. They want fast travel to be a chore. They want the vehicles to break down constantly so that you're forced to get out, fight the enemies who caused the breakdown, fix the car, and only then drive on. And you might have to do this multiple times on your way to an objective. This means that while an objective actually takes you 10 minutes to complete, that time is tripled because you have to get there, and you have to get out, and it's boring. it's also harsh. The driving is plagued with that issue, and when you're on foot, you're plagued with the issue of tiredness. Your character has malaria, and they're probably constantly on the edge of death. Your guy gets tired, he runs a shorter distance than I can run, and I can't run far because I'm incredibly unfit, and once he gets tired, the whole screen goes blurry as he catches his breath. This game wants to restrict you and what you can do because it wants to limit you. It wants to make sure you know you're not a complete badass.
The devs created this boring and harsh world so that it could limit us and force us into the boots of someone who actually isn't in control. Your power is taken away from you, and you don't get to have the Rambo-esque power fantasy that games often give us. Instead, you get to live in a world that has nothing but disdain for you, a world that actively hates you. Like the real world.
There are many ways to take power away from the player, ways far more numerous than those I've listed. H-Bomberguy has a fantastic video about Pathologic, in which he discusses similar ways in which power is removed from the player, although they were used more brutally in that game.
So, a fun aside, I've been planning this video for a good long while, but life gets in the way of things. And so when H-Bomberguy released that video I mentioned, I was like, great, now it'll look like I'm copying him, thanks H-Bomb. But that isn't what's happening here. I don't plagiarize. Not anymore. Not after the incident.
So, some of those methods that restrict player power, methods that H-Bomberguy also spoke about, so go check out that video, but preferably after this one, include how a game can restrict the player's access to currency, which Far Cry 2 does by making blood diamonds relatively few and far between, although there aren't many upgrades so it doesn't become too difficult, or it could restrict movement and fast travel, which we've already spoken about, make weapons unreliable, such as by slapping degradation onto them so they start jamming, or literally explode in your face, give the player unreliable roads filled with constant obstacles like enemies or difficult terrain, or you could literally restrict narrative progression by forcing the player to do extra missions so he can get some malaria pills so he won't go dying on you. You take all of these things and you throw them together in a single game, and that game is one that appears to be angry that you even want to play it. It wants to punish you for playing. But why does it want to punish you? Part 4. From bad to worse.
The game's narrative is the reason that the world needs to punish you. The world, despite all those horrible aspects, which could also be labeled flaws, depending on how you look at them, fits with the tone of the narrative. But what is the point of that narrative? Well, the point is pointlessness.
One of the major themes running throughout the narrative is futility, because regardless of what you do during the events that unfold, you will change nothing. Everything will keep going from bad to worse. And that isn't to say that the game doesn't start out from a bad place, because it starts bad. It starts real bad. Your character, regardless of who you choose from an array of ethnicities and backgrounds, is pointless. But I'll exactly why that's the case a little later on. Your character starts off as a mercenary who's been sent into the middle of Africa to kill an infamous gunrunner who seemingly vanished into thin air. This man is your sole target, but as soon as you arrive in town, you come down with a nice case of the malarias and pass out before you get to assassinate the poor old gunrunner. You flit in and out of consciousness before finally waking up with your prey, the Jackal, rooting through your stuff while you just lie there with the shakes. This gunrunner guy then does his little monologue reciting a few lines from Beyond Good and Evil, the Nietzsche book, not the game, and then leaves. He just leaves because you're not a threat anymore. You completely screwed up, and so the pointlessness of it all gets underway very early on. The town soon erupts into war, because in the European tradition of depictions of Africa, there must be bloodshed. Then you have to get up, stumble over to some weapons, and make your way out of town while being shot at from all sides. If you manage to get out of town, you pass out in the road and get rescued by one faction. and if you get gunned down in the street, which is often more likely, you'll wind up being rescued by another faction. You never could have escaped. It's all pointless. Once all that happens, the game opens up properly. You wake up in a safe house that belongs to one of the factions, although they're essentially identical to one another, so who really cares anyway? And then you start getting jobs. These jobs involve going and killing a bunch of people while doing something for the faction that sent you, such as assassinating a certain person, blowing up something, collecting some important piece of intel, etc., etc. Your entire function in the narrative is to act as a murderous errand boy, jumping from one faction to the next, doing jobs that slowly destabilize the country as a whole while harming the citizens who are in hiding and just screwing up everything for everyone. You are the bad guy. You're solely in this for the money, and you have no real stake in anything whatsoever. This isn't a political conflict for you like it is for these people. You're not going to grab power. You're not going to accomplish anything. Your sole function is to further destroy the nation and ruin everything. Many games have tried to make you the bad guy, usually in some over-the-top way like Overlord, but that's not what's happening here. Your character never even speaks or gains anything from the conflict other than cash for guns that can help you kill more people. You're expendable, and no one cares who you are. So who cares about the morality behind what you're doing? You're just taking cash for jobs after all, aren't you? Part 5. A moral imperative. So things go from bad to worse, as we know, and you're nothing but a mercenary who's looking for a quick buck. You have no moral compass as you jump from one faction to the next, completing near identical tasks that serve no one in the long run, and each faction claims that they have the interests of the people at heart. The United Front for Liberation and Labor, or UFLL, and the Alliance for Popular Resistance, or APR, are both trying to seize power in the country, and they don't care who gets hurt in the lead up to that. They care so little about who gets hurt that you even help each faction with its infighting. The leader of one faction is murdered because someone else wants to grab power, and you're the trigger man because you're not actually part of any faction. The leaders of these groups are constantly changing, but the groups themselves never change. Why would they? Their goals are interchangeable, and they don't care what happens so long as they're in power, which might sound familiar to anyone who pays attention to politics. Okay, so we're the bad guy here, right? We also know that these factions are the bad guys too, and we know that regardless of which leaders are assassinated, the factions will keep tearing the country apart because they don't give a damn about any of the displaced refugees who are hiding across the country and desperately trying to escape. These factions will keep destroying the country regardless of what you do, and once you start killing off leaders, it becomes apparent that as soon as one leader dies, another will just rise up to take his place. You can't cut the head off the snake, you just have to live with the snake. Here's where the game, or the developer, starts to worry about its morally iffy protagonist who never speaks yet engages in constant war crimes. The game's devs decide that, hey, our protagonist is dying of malaria. Who can give him some pills for that? Well, refugees, of course. Early on in the story, you start to help out religious and Red Cross-like organizations by delivering passports to refugees in exchange for malaria medication, because apparently your blood diamonds can buy you bazookas and AR-15s, but malaria meds are just way too valuable for those shiny stones. On the surface, this is a morally good thing, right? You're delivering passports to refugees so they can get out the country. But here's the thing, you're still in it for the exchange. Goods for goods, a service for a service. Capitalism must go on. However, because of this seemingly good guy act that isn't actually a good guy act, well, this kinda doesn't help your moral standing. This may be why it becomes a moral imperative for your ever-silent character to atone for his sins and redeem himself. Or maybe the devs just felt that they couldn't create a character this morally dark and get away with it.
but can he be redeemed? And is his redemption earned?
Part 6. The Apathy and Death of Companions.
So we know the protagonist isn't exactly a moral agent in the story, and we know that he ultimately goes after some kind of redemption. I mean, a silent redemption in which he never says anything at all, so it's kind of dulled, but a redemption arc nonetheless. We know he's trying to gain this through his very business-like relationship with some refugees, but there's also another angle to this redemption. You see, you get to have companions in this game.
When you start up the game, you get to choose from a cast of characters, as I've said before, but something interesting about this cast of characters is that all the characters you don't choose show up as companions in the game. No matter who you choose, everyone else you could have chosen but didn't is in the game for you to interact with.
I guess that's one way to make sure you use all the character models.
These companions, or buddies as the game calls them, are just like you see. They're all mercenaries and they all have their own motivations behind what they're doing. And just like you, they're all contributing to the destruction of the country as a whole. You're kindred spirits. Horrible, horrible kindred spirits. The way the game presents these people to you is that once you meet them, they offer you alternative routes to complete the missions the factions have given you. So, for example, one of the factions tells you to go do something horrific. You accept because you're a monster and those blood diamonds look just too damn good to pass up on. You get a call from your main companion friend and he or she, because there are a few female companions but you can't choose to play as them for whatever reason, tells you to do something other than what you were asked to do, such as a mission in which you're supposed to blow up an enemy outpost and your friend instead asks you to retrieve intel from a different place, and in exchange they'll help you destroy the outpost you were paid to destroy. You can choose to do that other thing if you want, but that thing is a less direct way of completing the mission. However, it will net the same result, although you do get in-game rewards in the form of upgraded safe houses for you to sleep at. But narratively, by doing this, you help your companion with what they want, and they help you in turn.
It's an I scratch your back, you scratch my back kind of thing, but with war crimes instead of helping a friend move.
At the end of each of these extended missions, you need to help your companion fend off some enemies, and then all is wonderful. For a while, because they end up betraying you. But hey, at least before they betray you, they come to your aid whenever you get shot too many times. So that's nice. Okay, so they end up betraying you. But that only happens at the very end of the game. By the end, you've decided that the best thing to do to absolve your sins is to team up with the guy who was originally your enemy, the Jackal, remember him? You see, everything comes to a head by the time the game is nearing its conclusion, because the factions they were always warring with each other are now uniting. And they're trying to drive out all the foreign mercenaries. And that means you and your companions too, and so you find yourself alone. The refugees are trying their best to get the hell out of the country, but you need a good old bribe for them. So what do? Well, you confront your old friends, many of which you thought were dead by this point, and they try to kill you so that they can use the bribe money to get out the country instead. So it's a kill or be killed situation. And I guess you can argue that it's okay to kill them here. But here's a quick side note. You can actually kill your companions earlier in the game, like when they're your allies, and then they won't show up here. So it's advantageous for you to murder your friends while they're still your friends, which is a kind of nifty thing the devs thought of for repeat players, even if it is morally wrong and doesn't really suit the tone of the narrative. Anyway,
by the time you get to the end of the game, you're alone, your enemy is now your friends are now your enemies, and after that they're dead. And all of that only adds to this harsh world we've got going here. The world is harsh, like the real one, and all of this makes it just a little bit harder to deal with the morality of the situation you're in. It also means that your redemption comes at one hell of a cost.
Part 7. The Irrelevance of the Protagonist. Okay, so we've chatted about the various companions that you ally yourself with and later have to murder, but here's a question worth asking. Who are those companions? The question to that is that they are, basically, you. You're a mercenary, you're just there for the cash, and you only came to the country in the first place because you've been hired to enact some extrajudicial murder on a man who's been a thorn in the side of the international community. He's an American, he's selling guns to warring African countries, and he's making the United States look bad, so it's time to take him out. That's all you're there for. It's not for moral reasons, it's to stop an international scandal over an American citizen being responsible for mass murder in a foreign country. Your character has no real stakes in the country. Sure, you can't get out easily because there's a war going on, but you only really stick around because you screwed up badly, got malaria, and found yourself stuck in the country. That's your sole reason for hanging around and committing a good number of additional atrocities.
This means that no matter what, no matter how many times you help whichever faction, and no matter how many times you work with refugees or companions or doctors or priests, you're an outsider in this story.
But this means that you're just like your companions. They're outsiders too. But why do I say that these companions of yours are essentially you? Well, because of the way you choose your protagonist. I've referenced it multiple times already, but let's actually discuss it properly now. When you start up the game, you get shown a couple pictures of men, and each man has a brief bio, and then you choose who you want to play. But you'll never actually see your character's face in game, and the choice only really changes the skin color of the hands holding the guns you shoot. So does it matter who you choose? No matter who you choose, every other person you could have chosen will be represented as companions in the game, and you'll never hear your own character's voice or see their face, and so the actions they perform are entirely up to chance. Your character only does what they do because they happen to have been chosen by you. Everyone you don't choose does something else in the game. This means that those companions could have been you, and you could have been those companions. Your character never undergoes any kind of character growth like the protagonist of later Far Cry games, because your character is a blank canvas. This is where your usual game critic person would say that a character like this is an audience representative character, and that they're just a blank slate on which you can project yourself. But I've always hated that idea because no matter what, you, the player, will never be this heartless mercenary who's murdering people in Africa. You are not the character. Just like you're not the protagonist of a movie you watch or a book you read. You're simply experiencing the life of a character external to yourself. The way of seeing what that character does is presented differently though. Instead of passively watching it, you're actively participating in it. This doesn't change the fact that they're not you though. But this argument could get a whole video of its own, so let's not get into it. However, this game doesn't allow you, the player, to see the protagonist's development as a moral agent who decides to sacrifice everything by the end, because the protagonist never speaks and never really displays any kind of personality. This means that the end of the game, which is supposed to be a big emotional payoff, is actually undeserved and boring. But let's talk about it anyway. Part 8. A Loose Adaptation. When the game ends, you're forced to choose between detonating an explosive that will destroy a mountain pass and allow all the refugees to escape, or you have to take a cache of diamonds to the border so you can bribe the border security people into letting the refugees through. In either case, you die. If you blow up the dynamite, you have to trigger it yourself and blow up, or if you take the diamonds, you end up shooting yourself for reasons. I guess the devs had to find a way that resulted in suicide regardless, because they knew that there was no way to turn this protagonist into a good guy by the end unless they sacrificed themselves.
So, this game isn't a very faithful adaptation of the book it's inspired by, is it? You see, this game is a loose, and I mean very loose, adaptation of Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. And when I say very loose, I mean it's more like an adaptation of Heart of Darkness. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. So I was gonna throw the book like back, just like, but my like laptop is there, so just gonna put it down. Continue on.
So what is Heart of Darkness? It's a 1902 novel by the Polish-born English novelist Joseph Conrad, a book that is somewhat unique in that it's a critique of colonialism from someone who was directly benefiting from colonialism at the same time as colonialism. In incredibly brief summary, the short novel follows Charles Marlowe as he tells the story of how he once took a journey deep into the jungles of Africa, into the Heart of Darkness, as it was known, and eventually learns about and then comes into contact with a man named Kurtz. This man is a brilliant colonialist who's done a great job subjugating the people under his control, but he started to go off the rails a bit and has descended somewhat into insanity. He essentially descends into darkness, and therefore he has a heart of darkness. It's so deep. So we have a book about colonialism that portrays and critiques someone who's really good at colonizing people, and we have a protagonist who follows this man into the darkness. So Far Cry 2 is like a really loose adaptation. It's still set in Africa, I suppose, but more of a savanna landscape rather than a Congolese jungle, although the last area in the game is called Heart of Darkness, so that's a bit on the nose in terms of subtlety. So the question is, why would they choose to adapt this book? First things first, this book is considered a classic of English literature, and we can get into a whole debate about what constitutes a classic, and I read a bunch of things with the title, What is a Classic, in preparation for this, and so let's just go with the commonly held, but definitely contested belief that this novel is a classic piece of colonial critical literature from the last decades of the colonial era. This book is more a source of inspiration than something directly adapted. The themes are adapted far more than the actual narrative. The themes of insanity, colonialism, the effects of colonialism, the othering of certain groups, etc., etc. Now, some of the other themes that are explored in Far Cry 2, such as the effects of warfare and the civilian cost of war, apply far more to that adaptation I was talking about before. That adaptation is the Francis Ford Coppola film Apocalypse Now. For those unfamiliar, this film is an anti-war film set in Vietnam which depicts a man named Captain Benjamin L. Willard, who's a military captain this time around instead of a ship captain, as he moves through the Vietnamese jungle with a small crew in search of an American colonel named Walter E. Kurtz, who's gone a bit insane with power. So you can definitely see the bones of Heart of Darkness there, but now it's all wrapped up in more of an anti-interventionist and by extension anti-neocolonialist bow rather than an anti-colonialist bow like its written predecessor. This is where the game gets far more of its influence. Everything in this harsh world gets worse and worse. Your character descends into his own Heart of Darkness, but with a lot less character to it, and eventually he has to find his own Kurtz, the Jackal, and instead of watching him die, he instead joins him.
Alright, so we've got our source material at the ready, we've looked at the game itself and everything that it does, we know where this thing came from and where it's going, so let's get academic with this shit.
Part 9. Is this post-colonial rewriting or just neo-colonial rewriting? Before we get into it too much, we should probably first clarify a few terms. We especially need to know 3 terms: colonialism, postcolonialism, and neocolonialism, and then we need to see how they apply to writing. We also need to know what intertextuality is, but we'll hold off on that for now. First off, colonialism. This is pretty simple. It's quite likely that you live in either a once colonized country or a country that used to be a colonizer. If you're from Europe, your country was probably a colonial power, such as England, Spain, Portugal, France, etc. These countries claimed land on other continents and made them part of their empire. This is why, for example, places like South Africa, Australia and India have such large English-speaking populations. This is why French can be found in Africa and Canada. This is why Spanish and Portuguese are all over South America. These countries imposed themselves on other countries, generally through superior military might, and subjugated said countries. A colonized country was pretty much the property of this colonial country. Even the United States, which refused to call itself a colonial power, essentially took over countries like Cuba and Nicaragua and turned them into protectorates, which is a fancy word for colony. Okay, so that's colonialism. It was fueled by various things. The good Christians of Europe needed to destroy the heathens of lesser countries, and so it was often framed as bringing civilization to the savages around the world. It was also a fantastic way to boost your own economic standing by exploiting the wealth of resources in places like Africa. I mean, Africa does have a whole load of stuff in it that Europe likes to use, such as gold, diamonds, and palm oil. Okay, so colonialism was a mission from God and a way of bolstering colonial economies. But it had to be justified, and this justification was often made with racist language.
The people whose skin isn't white are savages and need to be educated. They are cannibals and they believe in false gods. They don't have a written language. We need to save them. Also, they're racially inferior to us, and so we're going to develop fake science to prove it. I mean, look, black people's skulls are just inferior to white people's skulls. That's why we need them to be like slaves and to work the fields. This is science, so like, it's science, and like, facts don't care about your feelings, snowflake!
Literature then developed around these kinds of ideas. People came to believe the racial science that they'd been fed, and that's how you get stories like Robinson Crusoe, in which a white man saves a non-white man from dying and then immediately enslaves him. That's how we get stories in which people of color are portrayed as noble savages who commune with nature and are like hippies, but they're still backward savages, and so we need to dominate them. This literature was colonial literature, and Heart of Darkness came in at the tail end of that. It was during colonialism, but it was critical of colonialism. It was still filled with some pretty racist stuff though, such as the way every black person is described. And we're told, when discussing authors of books like these, well, that's to be expected. He was a man of his time. But does that make it right or forgivable? We're not here to discuss that particular topic, but it's something worth thinking about. So that's colonialism. And now we have post-colonialism to chat about. This does not mean, as that pesky little prefix post would have you think, that post-colonialism means everything after colonialism. Instead, it means things that are in response to colonialism. From that angle, you could even argue that something like Heart of Darkness is a piece of post-colonial literature. But post-colonial literature is generally considered to be things that are written by people from previously colonized countries about the effects of colonialism on colonized peoples and lands. These writers are concerned with a dialogue, a discussion between colonizers and colonized peoples, understanding and critiquing the way in which the history and effects of colonialism don't end just because colonialism itself has ended. Let's take an example. South Africa was a country that gained its independence a bit earlier than many other African countries. It was completely taken as a colony after the Second Boer War in 1902, and the English colonizers even subjected white Afrikaners to colonial rule, which is a bit more unusual than other countries. But they eventually gained their independence and shortly thereafter instigated the racial policy of apartheid, in which whites were declared legally superior to blacks. When you see old movies or anything about South Africa, or Jim Crow era America, you'll see signs that say whites only in certain areas. Those are the kind of racial laws I'm talking about. Fast forward till 1994, and South Africa has its first democratic election with all the races allowed to vote, and a black man, Nelson Mandela, wins the presidency. The white government retracts, and the country is thrown into the hands of people who've spent decades fighting for independence, but don't necessarily know how to run a country. The businesses are still predominantly owned by white people, and so there's a disparity between white and black, with whites having far more money than black people, even though they are by far the minority in the country. This new black government is then labelled as stupid and incompetent because they can't deliver European-level governance. But how could you have expected any differently? During apartheid, They were literally given an inferior form of education, known as Bantu education, and this was used to intentionally weaken any possibility of the emergence of a black educated class. There were many educated black people once apartheid ended, but not enough, and from there the problems pile on, one after the other. South Africa is actually a much tamer case than most, because the country was never entirely subjugated in the way many others were. But I happen to know it a lot better than other African countries, so that's why I spoke about it instead of examples that may have been more apt. Now we see from this that once the colonizer leaves a country, they need to find a way to maintain some sense of power. They want to keep their white-owned businesses inside black countries, and this is where neocolonialism steps in. It's not technically colonialism because there's no laws that say whites are in power, but they don't need laws because they have money. Neocolonialism takes many forms. You can argue that the United States government imposing itself on other countries to spread democracy and freedom is neocolonialism. The globalization of McDonald's and Coca-Cola is neocolonialism. The way in which Hollywood movies show us that the American way of life is superior to any other way of life is neocolonialism. It's anything that reinforces the ideas, and often the economic authority, of white people. It's anything that leads people to believe that what white people want is superior to whatever those inferior dark-skinned folk want.
Okay, so that explanation took a bit longer than expected, but it's important to understand this before moving on. You need to understand how colonizing countries came in and took over, how the colonized people responded, and then how colonizers consolidated and maintained power through the almighty dollar.
Now that we know what all of those words mean, we can ask the question, what was that other thing you were talking about? That thing that's on the title of the video, that rewriting thing. So, rewriting is simply the act of rewriting existing colonial literature and placing it within a new post-colonial context. If that sounds strange and immediately pretentious, it could be worse. The other term for rewriting is counter-discourse, so you should be thankful I'm using less annoying jargon. Post-colonial rewriting is when you take a piece of literature that is colonial in some way, and then you take what makes it colonial and you change it so that it now questions colonialism. Let's look at a few examples. The author I studied the most in university was J.M. Coetzee. He's a white South African author who's been writing about the plight of the colonized and the psychology of the colonizer since the 70s. One of his books is called Foe. This book takes Daniel Defoe's, see what he did there, classic novel Robinson Crusoe, which we talked about earlier. It's the one where the white man enslaves a non-white man as soon as he meets him, and reworks it. In this new version, the characters, who were in the original novel stranded on a desert island for years, now leave said island much earlier than in that classic story, and meet a woman who then tells their story to Daniel Foe, a writer who hasn't been all that successful until that point. This writer, who's obviously a stand-in for Daniel Defoe, changes the story to make it a better colonial adventure tale and completely excludes her, the woman who brought the story to him, from history. It's a book in which reality can be changed through published literature, and it shows how the contributions of women are silenced. It's a pretty famous example of post-colonial rewriting. Other examples are works like Rieza de Vet's rewrites of Anton Chekhov's classic plays, Louis Naura's rewrite of Shakespeare's King Lear, and Derek Walcott's rewrite of Robinson Crusoe. It's a popular classic to play around with for people who are into the whole post-colonial thing. So you take an existing story, often a famous one like Shakespeare's The Tempest or Sophocles' Antigone, and you rework it so that it's about something new, something post-colonial, something that criticizes rather than reinforces the colonial mindset that gave birth to that story in the first place. This is, at its base level, a form of intertextuality. I said I'd come back to this intertextuality thing. Intertextuality, and I'm afraid there isn't a less pretentious term for this one, or at least not one I was taught, is the existence of texts within texts. when you watch a movie and you see a reference to something else, to another movie. That's intertextuality. You only understand the reference because you're familiar with that other text. And the word text, in this case, could mean anything. A book, a movie, video game, comic book, song, etc. It's just easier than saying piece of art or something with even more words. So inter means between and text means, well, it means text. It's the interconnection of texts. You understand comedy because you've seen comedies before. You're familiar with things that happen because these things have happened before. When we see someone slip and fall in a comedy movie, we're supposed to understand that that is funny and it's happened before in other comedy movies. We only understand what's happening by relating everything we see to things we've seen before. A person who's never seen any piece of art and has never experienced life won't find anything funny, because how can political humor be funny when you've never heard of a politician before? This is how post-colonial rewriting works. You are familiar, hopefully, with the existing colonial texts, and so you understand the new rewrite. This is not necessarily the case, because there are plenty of people who have watched Apocalypse Now and have never read Heart of Darkness. But the ones that have read it can see things a layer deeper because they know where the plot beats and themes come from. It's like when you watch a movie with someone who's read the book and they're being annoying about it because the book is better. Well, in post-colonial rewriting, it isn't supposed to be better, it's supposed to be a response. Something that gets you thinking about it, thinking about the original works and critiquing what they did wrong.
Okay. So this is getting really intense and super academic and boring. How does this all apply to Far Cry 2? I mean, sure, I understand that it's kind of based on Heart of Darkness and Apocalypse Now, and it takes themes from both to construct its own narrative. It does what those other post-colonial rewrites do, but it isn't doing them to criticize colonialism, is it? It's just a game. I mean, games can't be political after all. Anyway.
Here's the thing. Far Cry 2 wants to be post-colonial. It has everything going for it. It criticizes how foreign mercenaries come in and help destroy warring countries. It shows how foreign interests cause squabbles between political parties because they want that dollar from Europe. It depicts refugee crises in countries like this, the endless wars, the malaria issue. But here's the thing. In Far Cry 2, who saves everyone in the end? Who is the great unsung hero who's forgotten by time? The man who saves all those refugees and redeems himself. A white gunrunner who had a touching change of heart. The Jackal is Far Cry 2's version of Heart of Darkness's Mr. Kurtz. But instead of being irredeemable, he redeems himself at the end by saving all those refugees from the bloodshed and mayhem that he's responsible for. It's a redemption arc, and that redemption supposedly transfers to you because you help him. But as we've already seen, you're a pointless character. Sure, in the beginning you can choose to be a black or Asian guy, which might undermine the white hero narrative, but that doesn't matter because you're not really the main character here. The Jackal is. You're just following orders like you've always been doing, voicelessly doing as you're told. Then, because the game has at least some sense of self-reflection, it ends with these words. Following the exodus, over 2 million refugees were displaced to neighboring countries. Aid organizations noted a surprisingly small number of civilian casualties. This was credited to the life-saving efforts of the underground movement within the country. The remaining leadership of the APR and the UFLL united to form an interim government in an attempt to impose order on the fractured country. They failed. Anarchy rules to this day. Ruben Oluwagembe, a reporter character in the game, his coverage of events has been ignored by the international press. He plans to publish the story independently on his personal blog. There's a small final bit about the Jackal, but that doesn't matter. So that's depressing. You saved the people, but no one cares and everything is still terrible in the world. You accomplished nothing of real meaningful consequence outside the lives of those refugees, even if the number of refugees is pretty significant. There's still obviously people left in the country. You've likely inflamed things and made everything even worse for them. Not every refugee will have gotten out after all, and this is actually quite a post-colonial thing. The white man comes in, breaks everything, tries to fix it, and then fails because it's beyond fixing. But despite all that, he's still portrayed as the hero in the story, a man who sacrificed himself for all those black faces. That's a bit more neocolonialist, isn't it? This reinforces rather than undermines colonial sentiments. Only the white foreigners can save you, but even they may not be able to. And if what they do results in nothing good, then what hopes do you have, O colonized people of the world?
Okay, so that was a lot, but what was the point of it all? Why did I do this whole long video?
Conclusion. When I first started planning out this video, I did so with the title Far Cry 2 and Postcolonial Rewriting, because I was going to talk about how this game is a postcolonial rewrite of Heart of Darkness and Apocalypse Now. Then I started doing research, and I started reading the text that is Far Cry 2 more closely. I saw that I was wrong. I saw that I needed to change the direction of the video essay. As I did more research for this game, I started to see both Far Cry 2 and Heart of Darkness in a very different light. My understanding of it all started to change, and that's when I added these 3 extra letters onto the title, Neo. I started to see the neocolonialism through the disguise of postcolonial dressing. Once I saw that, I could never unsee it. And this is what I want to leave you with. We take things for granted. We think we're real clever because we might know big words like postcolonial rewriting, and we think we can apply it to something without thinking. We think we understand the world, but we often don't. We take so many things for granted, and we're unwilling to change the way we think about it. We're unwilling to look at things in a new light because we think that changing our minds is a sign of weakness. But it isn't.
We need to learn to see the secret invisible strings that pull on us. They don't necessarily control us, but through centuries of art that has told us white people are superior and that we have the answers, maybe we need to actually start trying a bit harder. Maybe we need to own up to where we may be wrong and try to do some course correction. But that's just a suggestion. So bye-bye for now, and next time I'll try to be slightly less pretentious with what I make a video about. I hope you have a great day further. And always remember to think about the media you consume and what it's actually saying. See you next time.
Then wait for me. The UFLL has work to do. Are you healthy? Can you fight? Let's see you fight for Adim Bantwe.
You still sick? Not gonna waste my time on a sick man. Malaria situation's out of control. Turns out the APR's got a lock on some sort of remedy.
A plant that grows here, Artemisia, a very potent plant. Our medicine men know exactly how to use it.
Yeah, anyway, as I was saying, the APR's got a system for drying out the plant, turning it into medicine. They've got these kilns, see, up in the Doggone Cliff Village. We'd like you to smash these kilns into bits.
Then okay, nobody gets medicine. This is Tambosa's fault. He is to blame with his selfishness and favoritism. If the APR want to know where their medicine has gone, they need only to look at their leader.
Stones, uncut. Just so we're clear. Go to the Doggone Cliff Dwellings and destroy the kilns. It's kill or be killed, China. You choose which side of that line you want to be on.